Thank you so much for that speech calling on LO.
Hi, can you check that I'm audible and visible, please?
Yes to both.
Just let me set up my timer really quickly. I go by she, her pronouns, and I will accept verbal POIs, please. I want you to imagine a world where people prioritize their own goals over the needs of others, where families drift apart because personal success comes first, where the elderly are left to fend for themselves in isolation, and where communities crumble under the weight of distrust and selfishness. A world where competition reigns and the vulnerable are discarded because they're seen as burdens. This is a world that Proposition pushes for, so proud to oppose. I want to clarify before I begin on the characteristics of collectivism, right? Collectivism does not mean completely neglecting the concept of human rights. While we recognize that there are certain boundaries and state and community should not cross, we simply do not advocate for over-independence and self-reliance to the extent it is detrimental to both the individual and society as a whole. So what does collectivism actually look like, since Proposition didn't bring to you the full picture? Collectivism looks like feeling a greater sense of attachment and responsibility to an individual community and the people within it. It looks like actively advocating for altruism and community spirit, for example. And I think this largely manifesting people who are significantly more selfless and willing to sacrifice for their community. It also looks like the state as a whole be more willing to look out for everyone, including the marginalized and the vulnerable groups of people in society, instead of leaving them up to themselves for competition. Before I move on to my substantives, a few rebuttals for the House. First, Proposition comes up and tell you how individual starts movements that challenges long-standing social norms. But I want to point out that precisely because these movements are supported by the public, by a large group of people who share similar views, that they're sustainable in the first place. It is not like Martin Luther King gave a speech on how he has a dream, and all of a sudden he drastically increased the rights of Black people, right? He actually garnered support within the public, and this public is what made the movement sustainable. Take the same cases as all the examples Proposition brought to you on BLM, on feminist movement, whatsoever. That point, the exact examples they gave proves why collectivism is important, because we helped this social movement to be tackled by long-standing collective action instead of every individual failing for their considering their own interests and leaving the public out of their side because it does not concern their own profit. And because these social problems are way too big for individuals to tackle, they need collective action for systemic organic change. Second rebuttal then about the POI that the speaker gave on whether people are most likely to care for themselves and prioritize their own concerns. Notice how first Proposition concedes this, and what this means that even when they tell you that no individual is completely independent and devoid of human relationship, most of these relationships they form are transactional and competitive and largely surface level, which means they do not serve the actual function of providing emotional support to people. Third point then on innovation. Yes, we concede that to some extent, perhaps innovation is better in individualist societies, but also note that most of these innovations are driven by profit, i.e. people want to make the most profit for themselves, and therefore they delve into these fields. Things like climate change that do not concern people's profit as a large are left alone. But these are precisely the large problems that society as a whole need to tackle. Fourth point then on volunteering and it being organic and sustainable. But I want to point to you that precisely in individualist societies, people are less likely to start volunteering in the first place. And by sheer magnitude of how collectivist societies encourage people to act as a whole, act as a group, look out for other people in their communities, do we get not only a larger group of people to start volunteering in the first place by sheer magnitude, but also longer lasting volunteering. Now that I've gotten their case out of the way, moving on to my first substantive about how collectivist societies improves individual well-being and rights. a few tiers under this. Number one, how we ensure that basic rights are met. Notice how collectivism prioritizes public systems, for example, public healthcare, educational welfare, such as in the Scandinavian countries, right? It provides a safety net for the most vulnerable group of people in society who do not have anywhere to step back in. Now everyone has their basic rights met, regardless of personal circumstances, regardless of the arbitrary birth lottery that they got into, regardless of their socioeconomic status, whether they come from a rich family or a poor family. But for individualism, they leave it entirely up to this arbitrary sense of birth lottery, where every man looks out for himself and himself only. We are the only side that ensures overall life satisfaction by reducing this inequality. And let's do an incentive analysis on individualist people, right? They're far more concerned with their own personal political interests as opposed to actually helping the lowest common denominator within their society. Second tier, on how we support mental well-being. We know that individuals being entirely self-reliant is a unique myth, right? The risks of life are simply too huge. For example, unemployment, for example, illnesses or natural disasters. But in collectivist societies, these risks are shared by society as a whole and not endured by individuals alone. Now, families and community ties are treasured to share burdens and seek advice from, and therefore individual stress is reduced so much significantly. It gives people a sense of security, of even having the hope of recovering after being hit by something deeply traumatic and problematic, because now they know that not only do they have someone to turn to, but there are so many people who are in the same shoes as them, right? They constantly feel like they're contributing to a greater cause because they feel attached to the greater community, and therefore they see social work as meaningful. And those on the receiving end of social work will also find it so much more fulfilling that there are people looking out for them. We agree with proposition that humans are inherently social beings and we need social bonds, but we think that this is significantly weaker in individualist societies because one, they have an emphasis on self-fulfillment and personal achievement and things like independence, right? Time and effort. Note that an individual's time and effort is limited, i.e., if you dedicate so much of your time and effort to pursuing your personal goals, you're much less likely to devote them to form long-lasting, strong interpersonal bonds, which require a large amount of investment of time because you need to listen to the other person's problems. You need to be with them when they're at their ups and downs. This cannot be achieved by simply perhaps one conversation or a single meetup. It needs long, sustained time and effort, which is impossible for individualist societies to promise. And two, there is a reduced obligation in individualist societies to families and communities simply because of this model society pushes out to that there. Yes.
Yeah. I have a question. How exactly can collectivism prevent putting pressure on the desire of individuals to go in unconventional fields over traditional ones?
Well, it's really simple, really. Now, in collectivist societies, individuals are more likely to go pursue their dreams because they know that they have a safety net in case all fails. They know that their community is behind them to support them so that they can achieve their truest potential instead of having to be out there and compete against everyone else and being there on their own as isolated units of labor in capitalist societies. Now they have families and communities to turn to, which makes them far more likely to succeed. But moving back then, because they have reduced obligation to family and community, they often see them as burdensome people who are optional and can be given and taken away. And therefore, it reduces their sense of duty and shared responsibility. Because collectivist society is the only side that can support individuals, that can ensure that their rights are protected, that can empower society as a whole. So proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Calling on DPL.
Can I just have 30 seconds to gather?
If someone was speaking, the voice was very faint, so can you please speak up?
Am I audible now?
It's still a bit faint for me.
Let me just change my mic. 1 second. Does this work?
Yep, it's cool now.
Okay, just give me 1 second to get my timer. Right. I'll be starting in. Sorry, one second. Is it okay if I keep my video off? I'm on hotspot currently.
It's perfectly alright.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, when side opposition comes up here and tells you that, you know what, just being a little bit individualistic and thinking that your actions matter a lot means suddenly you get so pressurized that you suddenly just isolate yourself. We think that's not inherently true. We think that's the extreme case that they go ahead and take, because we think isolation does not exist. The way society works is interdependence still exists, because you need to have those bonds, and because reciprocity still exists. When someone gives something to you, you have this obligation to give back. So these genuine social bonds are still formed on our side. Two things in my speech then. Firstly, just taking down a lot of the substantive matter they give you within their first speech, but second, giving you one major argument and how you're able to get greater change because the collective because there's no longer collective action problem. Firstly, on rebuttals then, a few things. One, they come up here and tell you that, you know what, you're always going to put personal actions first. You're never going to, like, you're going to have so much raging individual competition with others that you're less likely to be selfless, that you're more likely to become a lot more selfish and prioritize your individual needs. We don't think that you're suddenly just going to go ahead and, like, but we don't think this is going to be like in the most extreme forms. This is because you can't suddenly just go ahead and forget your family. We think like social bonds still have to exist because of the virtue of one, you're going to have like call out from outside external factors who are going to tell you that you're morally wrong, that you're not going ahead and spending time with your family. Like social call outs still exist, but
QI.
the reason that you still have to spend time with your family is because you still have that moral obligation. Like you have to give back to them. You still have to form those bonds because the principle, because simply of the principle of reciprocity, where if they've taken care of you for so long, you have to give back, do things like take care of them when they're old, but also just uniquely spend time with them so that they're happier. But this uniquely note, like at the very top, that this is not like a state of nihilism where you just don't care about what's going on. It's just that you prioritize individual action over like this
QI.
collective action, but it's not like you suddenly forget it. That's not what we were supposed to support. But second, that entire thing on how like you're much more likely to change the world, because you know what, you can only get change when a lot of people come together. We think we're much more likely to get all of the change that they're talking about, because guess what, when I feel like my actions matter a lot, that is when I go ahead and contribute. When I feel like something that I am doing is changing the world, it matters a lot more, that's when I go ahead and like decide to contribute. Because on their side, the reason people don't actually go ahead and contribute is because they feel like there's so many people that one person not doing anything will not matter, that in the long run that they're not needed for this change. So lesser people actually opt into things like social movements because they feel like their one participation just doesn't matter. That ties into their entire thing about less volunteering. We think less volunteering happens in their side of the house when individuals don't feel like the things that they do value enough. So that's exactly why they just become complacent. But fourth, they tell you that, you know what, people just become isolated, they become fully independent. I've told you that's not how it works, because simply because dependency still exists, you still have institutions which call you out, but also uniquely like the way because you have to give back, because mutual relationships,
QI.
bond sharing will still exist on our side. But then two major responses to like one on their entire idea of the entire idea of too much individual too many individual tasks leads to isolation. We tell you that one, you need to still have collaboration, right? Like if I like the main counterfactual that we provided to you when we say that we prefer this individualism is that no, you suddenly don't just forget what is going on, you do not forget like your social bonds. The only thing that is different now is that you think that your actions matter a lot more. So this means that like as an individual, you would much rather opt into things because you feel like things that you are doing is making a significant change. This looks like you going ahead and not polluting the environment because you think that one person going ahead and polluting the environment still causes a lot of harm. That's when like individual, like the things that you do on an individual level, you think they matter a lot more, like the magnitude of
QI.
thing matters a lot more. That's when you become a lot more conscious about what you're doing. But like that does not mean that you suddenly go ahead and forget like you forget about like other people around you. The only thing is that actually we think it's a lot better for other people around you as well, because when I become more conscious about what I'm doing, that's when people around me also benefit from that. When I don't go ahead and pollute the environment because I think it's making a huge change, a huge damage, that's when people around me benefit a lot more. That's when like society as a whole is benefited. That's not when you go into
POI.
isolation. That's when you still have this social engagement, because you're able to get like because you're able to prioritize yourself. That means you're still better off mentally, and when you're better off mentally, we think that's when you're actually able to foster these bonds, and like have better connections with people. But then moving on to one major argument that we had on how individualism drives greater change, because the people's actions are valued more. We think the problem right now in the status quo is that in these collective systems, what happens is that
POI.
not right now. I'll take it in another minute. The what happens right now is that a lot of people feel that they're insignificant. That coming together is the only way you get this change, and then them individually doing something does not get any form of change. They feel like they're one powerless, but second that they just simply do not have the capacity to go ahead and get change. That individual action is just not impactful enough. This means that one, they go ahead and don't volunteer within these social movements, because they feel like one person joining in does not change anything, that they would much rather just like go to work instead of sitting for protest, because one person joining in just does not matter. So you're not able to get that critical mass for a lot of social movements. But second, it's just that because people do this, a lot lesser people opt into like practices which are generally good. Like within the environmental movement, lesser people actually go ahead and follow the rules, because a lot of them think that others will do it, that it's not their responsibility, because even if they did it, it won't make a huge change. Then what are the harms of this? We think that one, you're not able to get like a huge
POI.
change, because like sure, they tell you that you know what, these problems are really big, that the environmental movement needs like a lot of collective action to make change. Guess what? We think you need people to actually do stuff till on an individual level to actually get that collective action. Collective action only comes about when you have a group of people doing something, not when you have only like one or two individuals doing something. We think every individual does it on our side when they feel like what they're doing matters. On their side, you're not able to get this mobilization of support for these social movements. But second, people don't do anything that actually causes like social change. But three, we've already told you how you don't have like independent thinking, so you have like less people thinking of opinions and like having that discourse within these movements, which is generally worse, because you go into the you follow the same ideologies, and you don't have like proper intersectionality within these movements. It just becomes homogenous. But third, we tell you that the solution in our side was just to think that like to encourage their individual actions, because you tell them that they matter, what they're doing matters, and that they're powerful agents of change. That's when more people opt into doing tangible things. Because of that, the impacts that we get are that one, you value your efforts more, so that means more people go ahead and do things. But second, you're able to get more change within these social movements. But three, you don't form these echo chambers, so you're able to go ahead and get proper discourse and form different opinions. So proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Just a reminder to everyone within the room to take POIs. It will really help with engagement. So moving on, calling on yellow.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, just give me a moment to set on my timer. Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two questions for the house today. Number one, who gets better relationship or personal lives? And number two, on who gets a better society as a whole in terms of furthering our social movements. But before I get into that, just some rebuttals for the house. The first thing side opposition came up here to talk to you about is about how genuine social bonds are formed due to an obligation to give back, or that these individuals are less likely to be less likely to be selfish, right? We don't think that this is necessarily true, because on the first point on genuine social bonds, right, understand that they already concede that the nature of these sort of relationships are obligatory or transactional in nature. I.e., if I, under the system of individualism, had a choice, I wouldn't be with my family. I wouldn't be with this group of people that I am obligated to be with. Now, also understand that this sort of obligation stems from the concept of filial piety, right, which is really only present in areas in Asia, right? So we think that them just cherry picking this example out and not considering other regions like Europe, other regions like the USA, we don't necessarily think that this point holds any weight at all. And so therefore, we don't think that genuine social bonds form in the first place, and they already concede that they get worse relationships and worse personal lives. But then up to the second point, they talk to us about how, because of individualism, therefore due to things like self-fulfillment, you will contribute, and on our side we won't contribute because it's perceived that one more individual joining a movement won't really change anything. But understand that at the root of it all, what makes you empowered, what makes you want to contribute to society, what makes you want to contribute to movements like the feminist movement, like the BLM movement, isn't the sort of ideology of individualism or collectivism. The root of it all is it's things like your personal morals, your personal values, principles, and character that make you empowered to contribute to society. We also think that similarly, collectivism doesn't make you feel disempowered or incentivized to be inactive in these social movements, right? Because the thing is, if you put this into perspective, what side opposition here is saying is that me as a huge advocate for African American minority rights, right, will not be incentivized to join the movement because of the fact that I'm under a system of collectivization, right? This is just completely untrue. We don't think that side opposition can just get away with saying this. So therefore, understand that the incentive behind this incentive behind a large majority of people in these movements are for things like social change and things like social justice, and not for individualism or collectivism. Furthermore, we think that since individualism prioritizes your own needs and wants over the community, sort of the direct definition already clashes and conflicts with social movements as a whole, right? Which is to protect individuals that are not you, which is for you to serve a higher purpose, a higher cause. And so therefore, insofar as the sort of definition is already conflicting and clashing, we don't think that side opposition can come here and just co-opt these benefits. Okay, so then on to my first substantive, on to sort of the impacts as well as the harms of individualism as a whole. Before that, I'll take a point. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so understand that individualism breeds of a sense of loneliness because of the way that it's inherently structured and different from collectivism, right? Understand that individualism, tells you to be independent. Individualism tells you to prioritize your own rights, your own happiness, your own needs and wants over others, right? So therefore, we think that this sort of necessarily isolates each individual in society to care for themselves more than they care for others. And yes, we do concede that individualism probably allows for people to be more different, but these differences are precisely what leads to things like isolation, from feeling that others cannot relate to your struggle. And understand that individualistic society is also way less likely to actually reach out and seek help, since the belief that they should be self-reliant has likely been inculcated within them from the very start of their lives in childhood, right? So it's likely simply an opinion that they carry forward throughout their entire lives, right? So to put this into perspective, when your parents, your teachers, and your governments continuously send the message and feed you this narrative and rhetoric that it is better to be self-reliant and not depend on others, it is better to be independent, have your own income, live on your own, you probably get people who see reaching out as an unnecessary endeavor and people who believe that they can solve their problems alone, right? Also understand that collectivism therefore protects individual rights. Understand that in status quo, powerful individuals have this sort of incentive to exploit others for greatest personal gain and profit, right? This looks like things like lobbying in the government, for instance. And unchecked competition exacerbates this. So therefore, collectivism as a whole can act as a check and balance, in the sense that a collectivist society protects your individuals in society from the worst harms by standing with those at a risk of exploitation and ensuring fairness. For instance, having trade unions, for instance, having collective bargaining prevents workers from being underpaid or overworked in a capitalist society where they are viewed as units of labor devoid of human emotions, right? So therefore, you humanize these very vulnerable individuals, you restore their human dignity, you give their rights back to them because of the simple fact that everyone is considered in the minds of the people. So therefore, the sort of decision making you get by the authority considers everyone's needs. So therefore, your marginalized groups are not ignored or suppressed. For instance, in some countries where collectivism is set in place, you have things like universal healthcare, you have things like trade unions and collective bargaining. Right. So regardless of socio-economic status, we believe that we are better in opposition in this regard of protecting individual rights. So before I go on to my second substantive, take note that collectivism does not breed over-reliance on the government or a governmental abuse of power. Collectivism, on a principle scale, stands for communities putting other members of society first and having a sense of loyalty to the community as a whole and not the incumbent government. People obviously can identify with as being a separate, independent actor. That means that any form of governmental abuse or side opposition maybe will be met with pushback since it will presumably be detrimental to the people on the ground. So then on to my second substantive, which is on sort of how collectivism benefits society as a whole, right? Now that I've taken down, now that I've won the clash on who gets better personal lives, who gets better relationships, I'll be talking about who gets a better society as a whole. But before I go into that, any points? 3, 2, 1. Okay, so understand that in a collectivist society, you sort of get more coordinated effort because people are more willing to reach out to each other. People are more willing to rely on each other for not just for things like finances, but also for things like bonds and relationships, right? Because note here that our relationships aren't in nature obligatory or transactional, unlike inside oppositions which they rightfully concede. And so therefore because individuals in collectivist societies have a strong sense of duty to support one another to tackle societal challenges, we think that these sorts of movements and social justice movements are much more coordinated, right? And furthermore, understand that collective action, like in individualist societies, collective action becomes a problem, right? Because everyone probably is perceived, or people perceive to be better off if people don't perceive to be better off if they act together. But again, even if they perceive that they are better when they act together, they don't do so because they probably see it, they need to meet things like personal sacrifices. They probably see things like conflicting interests. Hence, we believe that they are worse off in terms of creating things like policies and movements as a whole. As such, this side proposition, the side that gets better personal lives and the side that gets a better society.
Thank you for that speech. Calling on government to.
Alright, cool. Do you mind if I have my camera off because I'm facing some network fluctuations right now?
It's fine.
Okay, am I clearly audible then?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, 30 seconds to organize my notes. In the meantime, pronouns are she, her. POI preference is chat, please. Please don't verbalize. But all that said, I'll be starting on my first word. Alright, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. On the top of my speech, note that this was a narratives debate from first. That is to say, they did not have the fiat to say all actors in this debate are altruistic, nor can they change their thinking, because for all of their benefits, you need people to be A, selfless, B, not have the prerequisite of a capitalist society, which we don't think changes on either side. And they had to prove why a capitalist society wouldn't even exist to get all of the impacts that they wanted on not having transactional relations, right? They don't tell you what their alternative to this capitalist society is, and they don't tell you why the narratives of capitalism do not exist on their side of the house. We do not get why these narratives are going to be internalized to the point where you do not have things like obligation. We do not get why people are suddenly going to care about relations even in a collective society, because there are internalization challenges, and they had to prove why every single actor in this debate internalizes it well enough to have a significant gain in relationships. But even if not, let me deal with that under a clash. Before that, let me clarify a few things in this debate then. First, let's talk about what is individualism, because they give you these preconceived notions about individualism. It is the idea that the freedom of thought and action is the most important quality of society, right? Rather than shared effort or responsibility. That is to say, you have consequences for everything you do, yes, but we'll tell you why relations still exist. But we can also claim the impact of accountability and why individuals are much more accountable, which leads to positive social goods later on, right? But secondly, note that the average individual in society will not internalize a narrative that says be totally selfish, because that is not what individualism is, and there isn't buy-in to ideas like that. That is to say, for the motion to be feasible in the first place, the narrative of individualism has to be somewhat in line with social values, right? So any unreasonable pushes from them do not stand in the first place. That is to say, they do still care about things like family, things like relationships, which are not a delta because it's an unreasonable push, right? Thirdly, then, let's talk about personal achievement and fulfillment. They concede that this still exists on their side. So we're unclear as to why all of these transactional relations are not going to exist on our side, but more on that later. Fourthly, then, to the average person on our world, their goals come first, yes. But to the larger extent, you still follow the norms of society, and we tell you that this is uniquely able to overcome the oppressive norms that they don't want to follow. I'll take the POI later. Okay, lastly then, note that the society that we live in is largely individualistic when you look at like bigger nations like USA, etc. That is to say, the impacts are not as bad as they claim, because we do still think the average person, even if they're living in the USA as they can see, still does care about their family, still does take care of their family, etc. And we don't get any reason as to why this is necessarily untrue. One major clash then on which world is more isolated and also which society is much, much better. But before that, let me take your point. 3, 2.
Yeah, okay. So regarding your entire framework regarding how exactly, there's a capitalist society, you do understand that you can have a collectivist society while also remaining capitalist. And also your entire point about individualists, our frame of individualists being really extreme doesn't really apply, because inherently you are supporting
I'm going to cut you off there because the POI is beyond 15 seconds. But even if you say that you're going to have a capitalist society with collective narratives, we don't quite understand why these narratives that are exclusive to capitalist societies, these look like things like the principle of having transactional relations, are going to change on your side, because these are inherently tied with capitalist society. Competition is inherently tied with capitalist societies, and more on this later. And that wasn't actually a POI, that was a rebuttal, but whatever. Let's talk about the isolated world then. Firstly, let's talk about the characterization differences. Let's talk about the vulnerable being discarded and whatnot, right? Firstly, and also about over-independence. Firstly, over-independence doesn't exist because the principle of reciprocity still exists. That is to say, no human being can actually shoulder everything on their own. We don't think that this debate was about stoicism, it's about individualism. Even if people are individual to the larger extent, humans are inherently social creatures that we get a concession to in first, and this isn't even the most important impact, right? Even even if it's a collective society, even if you stand with the vulnerable, we tell you all of this in exclusive, more on this later. Secondly, let me deal with community spirit and how you have selfless people and whatnot. Firstly, note that this was a narrative debate. That is to say, we don't understand why people are going to be altruistic actors on their side, because we tell you that we don't know what the current alternative is to the ultra competitive capitalist society that they just conceded still exists on their side. Secondly, we don't hear any answers to why all of these benefits are going to be realized in the first place, and it's too late to hear an answer to this. Thirdly, even if we have to talk about this, we don't think over selflessness is a good thing either if you're going to talk about over individualism, because it leads to many personal sacrifices, which is inherently bad for any average person as a whole. Let's talk about the state looking at minorities. We don't think that this is a delta, because the state still has objectives like, electoral objectives to still care about minorities, and we don't think state is an altruistic actor. Secondly, we don't understand how governments get much better on their side, because conflicting decisions still exist, and to the point where they concede that people are cookie cutters with the same way of thinking on their side. That's a large burden that they take on that we don't even have to engage with, because that's just inherently bad. Let's talk about profit-minded. We tell you that, capitalist society still exists on their side, concession to that in the POI that you just heard panel. Let's talk about volunteering and social justice movements as a whole. Note that this wasn't a zero-sum debate, so they claim that more people actually volunteer on their side. But let's talk about social movements, right? Firstly, they tell you that there's more buy-in into movements because of collective action. Collective action still exists on our side. Why? Firstly, what is collective action? Collective action refers to action taken together by a group of people whose goal is to enhance their condition, right? Individualism doesn't mean you can't buy into collective action, provided that it comes under your incentives, right? That is to say, if a Black person wanted to join the BLM movement, they can still very well join it, because it means that by effecting structural change, they're better able to rise in society. Secondly, if your priority is the communal good, you can still join, provided that it also aligns with your individual interests. If your priority is climbing the ladder of society, you can, and we'll tell you why this is still good. Note that both of these are good ways to affect social change. Why? Firstly, when you have an individual who's high up in society, we think that they become the face of things like movements that get greater buy-in, because now they can restructure the system within the system. Why doesn't this happen on their side? A, you have active stigma against opinions going against the communal narratives. Secondly, the prerequisite to structural change is to have people who actively voice out, which leads to more collective action, and transactional relations still exist. Let's talk about ensuring basic rights. We don't even see why this changes on either side, because the average person still does have empathy, right? That is to say, you're not going to discard someone, because this debate wasn't about utilitarianism, and humans aren't inherently utilitarian, they are empathetic. Secondly, even if people don't have empathy, even in our worst case, right, we tell you that there are social norms that force you to actively take care of people and actively give rights to everyone because of the social stigma against discrimination, and that is why we are so proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech calling on opposition vote.
Am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Thank you. Just give me a moment to set up my timer and drink a bit of water. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. A house divided cannot stand, and a society divided into billions of individual parts with individual incentives, all selfishly clawing at what they want, cannot fundamentally function. No man is an island, so we don't think that side proposition forcing each individual to be one is just or is good for them. There are two main points of contention for the House today. First, on the people on the ground, and second, on wider society. I'm going to first be tackling this idea of the people on the ground, because I think this gets a lot of engagement throughout the debate, and it's one of their main pushes, so if I take it down, they basically don't really have a case. What do they tell us about the people on the ground? They tell us that people will feel more empowered, and that individualism allows for people to do things like actualize and find their own, sense of direction within their lives. Sure, some people will feel fulfilled. I agree with that. But there's also a chance for people to feel isolated, as we've already told you, since you have far less clear sense of direction in your life and internalize the idea that you need to deal with your problems yourselves. Right? The fact of the matter is that individualism inherently suggests that you should be more self-reliant, that you should rely on other people less, and that other people should rely on you less. That is the core thesis of of individualism that they don't seem to fundamentally understand on their side of the house. So they have to concede to the fact that it will to some extent lead to you relying less on others and lead to some sense of isolation, since it creates more differences between each individual person. Likewise, collectivism does probably lead to you feeling happy in situations in which you feel as though you are part of a bigger society and a wider cause, right? The precise reason as to why people opt into social movements is to feel like they're contributing to something greater than themselves, and that provides a lot of people with purpose even within an individualistic society, as they've already considered, right? So having a society that actively advocates for you to contribute to something bigger than yourself is probably just far safer when it comes to guaranteeing happiness. But thirdly, if we teach people from youth that the community's net benefit is important, they probably won't feel super affected by the fact that they are making personal sacrifices, because insofar as we are teaching them from youth that they should be prioritizing the community and that making the community, a better place is something which is a meaningful endeavor, they're unlikely to feel as though their personal sacrifices are really, really emotionally bad, because they don't personally prioritize their independence over the community. The lack of independence won't make them sad. But okay, so this clash is already likely won by us, but let's give them all the charity that they want, and let's assume that they win this clash on people on the ground, right? We tell you that this clash is probably just going to be a wash anyway, because of the fact that, your individual happiness really depends on you. Some people will feel lost on your world. Likewise, some people might feel trapped in our world. But we tell you that this argument is a complete wash, and therefore their main push already fails. But what do we get on the main clash of today's debate on wider society? Okay, before I get to the wing, I'd like to point out two main responses that they give us throughout today's debate. First, on this idea that the principle of reparation or reciprocity will still exist on their side of the house, and second, on this idea that individualism leads to liberalism. I want to first tackle this idea of the POR. What do they tell us about the principle of reciprocity? They tell us that reciprocity can exist, and that people will call you out if you are being selfish on their side of the house as well, and that human empathy inherently exists within a lot of people, and therefore they won't be selfish. I think they fundamentally misunderstand what they are standing for here. Yes, individualism does create people who care more about their individual interests, but that always comes at the trade of them being more selfish, right? The fact of the matter is that when you tell people and when you give them the narrative that they should prioritize their own selfish well-being and that they should not prioritize the greater good of the community, it's unlikely that this principle of reciprocity even exists in the first place, because POR inherently stems from a duty to others that is completely absent in a world in which you are teaching people to prioritize themselves, right? Collectivism advocates for the POR. So if they want to have this principle, we flip it and we tell you that it's only applicable on our side of the house. But secondly, the second response regarding how exactly they will still get people to be individually responsible for others is this idea of call-outs. I don't understand this idea of call-outs. Insofar as your community is inherently individualistic and each individual member within your community prioritizes themselves, why on earth would they call out other people? They won't see them being selfish as something which is inherently wrong, so it's unlikely that they're even going to call them out in the first place. So both of their max as to how exactly they get empathy and they get people who are unselfish fail. Okay, then they get to this idea of liberalism. They try to tether this idea of liberalism to individualism, right? This gets not a lot of development, but I'll develop it for them. They try to claim that, okay, if you get individuals who care more about themselves, that makes it so that you get more community good, you get more liberal movements and stuff like that, and stuff like the LGBTQIA plus community, because people are more concerned about their individual rights. I'd like to point out three things. First of all, it's not true, right? Liberalism doesn't inherently stem from individualism. The fact of the matter is liberalism fundamentally has nothing to do with it. It instead probably stems from a few other factors. Firstly, it probably stems from the fact that people are simply more acutely aware of the different groups and individuals that exist within society today. That's to say that more people are aware of things like the LGBTQIA plus community, and therefore they support it. But secondly, people are more aware about the suffering that these individuals feel, since it's been vocalized far more in recent times, right? More people have come out and talked about the struggles that they had, and therefore the empathy that they want to talk about probably still manifests on outside the house. But third of all, we tell you that collectivism can also subsume this benefit just through a different mechanism. Insofar as these communities are suffering en masse, for example, the LGBTQIA plus community constantly feeling as though they are oppressed, collectivism and the duty that people feel towards minimizing net suffering will probably still translate to the progress you want anyway. Before I continue, POI. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we've already dealt with basically the entire push regarding wider society. What else did they tell us? They tell us that individualism is empowering. Take note, panel, like empowerment has nothing to do with today's debate. Collectivism does not serve to disempower, and individualism does not serve to empower. I can still feel like I'm contributing to the wider community and therefore feel fulfilled, right? It's not true that being part of collectivism makes my individual actions feel less weighted. In fact, it probably makes it feel more weighted because I feel as though I'm contributing to something greater than myself. And therefore, then we tell you that that is probably going to be won by us as well. While, okay, so now let's get on to what we tell you and what they say in response. They try to claim and co-opt this benefit of having more support for social movements. They claim that they get collective action with environments. And then in third, they have this really, really strange mech and way to prove it. They say that people will still care about these communities and they will still care about movements insofar as it aligns with their own individual interests. That's precisely our point. The only situation in which you're actually going to get social change on your side of the house is if people feel the need or if they feel as though their selfish interests align. So if I'm a rich benefactor within a society, for example, I will feel no empathy towards the poor and I will feel no duty or necessity to actually help them insofar as it doesn't align with my own selfish interests. We ask you whether or not this is legitimately a society that allows for progress, right? And we tell you that it's just simply not true. We tell you a lot of things that they don't get to. We tell you that positive policies are only uniquely achieved when you care about people on the ground, when you care about the people who aren't necessarily yourself. The issue with individualism is simple. Yes, we concede to the fact that collectivism does have the capacity to be misconstrued in certain instances in which the rights of individuals might be, less prioritized in comparison to the rights, to the interests of the general community. But we prefer this to a world in which everyone only cares uniquely about their own interests and only votes politicians in who care about their specific group, for example, right? We tell you individualism breeds selfishness and selfishness leads to the ruin of society. The idea of interdependence doesn't make sense. We tell you that very, very simply put, their society cannot fundamentally function or progress. Collectivism is the only way forward, and I've never been prouder to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Calling on opposition reply.
Hi, can you check that I'm audible, please?
Yep, you're audible.
Give me a moment to just organize my notes and set up my timer. Imagine a world where everyone looks out only for themselves, whether intentionally or not, whether they want it or not. This is the reality of individualistic societies that proposition needs to accept no matter what. Two broad questions for the House today then. One, on which side benefits individuals, and two, on which side benefits societies as a whole. For individuals, I want to divide the benefit onto one, physical needs, and two, in terms of their emotional well-being. Notice how, as a first speaker, I brought to you this whole mechanism about how collectivist societies is the only side that can protect the physical needs of individuals on the ground and provide a safety net for the most vulnerable groups of people through government actions like free health, universal healthcare, or education, etc. No response whatsoever from prop, so we take it as a concession. We tell you that we provide a safety net for people and we do not depend on factors outside people's control, right? The exact example of USA they gave is grappling with healthcare. Millions of people are suffering and they're too scared to even have a surgery or any treatment. This is a world that we want to avoid. We want a much more caring, empathetic world where people are not afraid of falling into risks or dangers because they know that there's always someone pulling them out. But moving on to the more engaged impact on emotional well-being, we gave you two reasons why. emotional well-being is so much more likely to be better on our side of the house, right? One, we told you that risks and problems are not yourself anymore. They're not contained within yourself. Simply sharing it with someone else or seeking advice with our closely knit family or communities will make you feel so much better in the first place and reduce the loneliness or stress when faced with them. And two, you have enough time to form deep bonds because you're not chasing these endless goals in a rat race. What proposition tells you is that, oh, you have social obligations, and at one point it is very difficult for you to internalize. But we want to tell you that we are brought up constantly and fed this model of individualist societies, of every man looking out for themselves, of people thinking about their own priorities before everyone else. It's extremely easy for them to buy in this narrative of how they have to prioritize their needs themselves. And while, yes, humans are social creatures, we tell you from the very get-go that this relationship, interpersonal relationship, is significantly weakened on their side. And also, as my third speaker pointed out, the principle of reciprocation does not stand because it only exists. It inherently is a collectivist idea. Now that I've gotten this out of the way, then on which side benefits society as a whole? I want to divide this into two impacts that it brought to you, right? One, on movement or volunteering. The whole line of logic for proposition throughout is how people feel empowered. They feel like their action matter without any mechanism or how it actually happens, right? On opposition, we tell you, let's analyze this on a spectrum. For those who want to volunteer, we think that their moral compass is strong enough for them to volunteer anyway. They have the sense of consciousness. They will have the sense of empathy and helping out those who are in need. But we are the only side that helps this sense to be sustained because they now see that they're volunteering for something, they're serving something much larger than them. They're more likely to care for people around them in their community out of this altruistic sense, right? But then on the other end of the spectrum, for those who do not actively want to volunteer or those who are sitting on the fence, we see it is so much worse on proposition's world because now with this society telling you that, hey, it is okay to prioritize your own personal goals and fulfillments, people are much less likely to start volunteering in the first place. By sheer magnitude of people who are wanting to be charitable, who does social work, we take this benefit. On the second benefit that they try to push to, that on innovation, on how people think differently, but also notice they're providing no mechanism on how they can overcome barrier. Notice how the barrier to entry for pushing out innovation and sustaining them is extremely high for research and development and fine-tuning them. We tell you that it is not true because collectivist society, a supportive society, is the only side that can support this effort and sustain them to push them to actual success. We also tell you that even if it's true, it's largely to be profit-driven and for their own. And because we are the only side that benefits not only individual physical and emotional well-being, but also protects society, so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Calling on government reply.
I'll be I'll be starting in 1 second. I just need my time. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Beside opposition, suddenly collectivism means that every single individual forgets about their individual needs and becomes extremely selfless. We tell you from the very top that within, like insofar as society is capitalistic, that means counter narratives still exist. When you live in this capitalistic society, that's when you have so many other narratives that exist that tell you that you have to be like the richest, that you have to have enough money to like go ahead and support your family and get food on the table. That is when you forget about collectivism. That's when everything they talk about goes ahead and fails because people don't show up to like things like strikes because they work instead to get wages, because they don't feel like they can even make change, because they don't feel like individual action matters that much. Things like wanting to reach the top is something that these humans inherently feel. That is something you cannot remove from them. Like incentives to do better on a personal level still exist. You don't suddenly just become selfless. We think it's much more likely to play out in a way where like the amount of collectivism that they talk about getting on their side will still still exist on our side, because we think like, I'll be telling you this further down my speech, but at the very top, just dealing with like a few other things that they tell you that are minor. One, they tell you that, you know what, you're going to be able to get like more innovation and stuff because more people support you. So like collectivism means that more ideas come along because when you have a more supportive environment. We think that's not inherently true, because we tell you from like our first speech that when collectivism takes place, that means like the extreme form of collectivism they talk about on their side means that you don't actually go ahead and form your own opinions or like innovate in your own, because this becomes so homogenous. You go ahead and follow like similar ideologies all the time, but you don't actually innovate or like go beyond, like go to different pathways. You follow like the conventional norms, you stick to the same societal norm. But second, what like weighing off actual collectivism and what is actually like to play out, like that we've told you already, versus individualism. One, we think that like we've already told you why people don't completely become selfish on our side. This is to say, because we live in a capitalistic society and interdependence still exists, because you live around with like institutions around you, you have to give back to them. Like we've already told you from the beginning that obligation still exists, and insofar as you're being sustained because the people around you are like helping you out, because you get like things like the food that you get is because a farmer is working out there, that obligation still exists, so you're still interdependent. That does not mean you suddenly go ahead and isolate yourself. The dependency will still have to exist, because they already tell you from first that humans are social creatures, but also uniquely like social contract and like moral obligation still exists, so you have to like give back to the people. You still have those family ties that you have to maintain. But even if like we completely concede to the entire relationship thing, we don't think that it's important enough to win them the debate, because insofar as we've been able to prove to you from the top how you're still able to get like economic innovation because more people have incentives to like do better, but second, you just get like more support for social change and social mobility. I think that ways we take that. But second, they tell you that but like that even if we go ahead and concede and say that, you know what, people are going to be really selfish, we think that's still fine, right? Because even as like an average individual, the goals that I have, like the dreams that I want to fulfill, are probably like, one, I just want to become really rich, but second, I just want to like live in a better world. We think like a lot of the goals that people want are going to overlap, so you're still going to get that form of collectivism, because people will want like similar things. And also, even if it's like completely selfish motives, like you want to become really rich, we think that still goes ahead and indirectly helps the economy. We think so like, one, either your goals are overlapping, or second, the benefits that you get go ahead and benefit other people. So like society as a whole like still benefits even if your intentions are selfish, but that amount of selfishness we think still exists on their side. We don't think it's exclusive. Insofar as we've been able to prove to you how we get that social change, but we also get economic change, I think we take this.
Thank you so much for that speech, and thank you everyone for this amazing debate. Please give me at most 10 minutes to deliberate and submit my ballots.